Well, here we are again. I've decided since we passed the midway point of the class, it was time to change things up a little bit. So we have a little more lively music and a little bit different background for our picture. So what we're going to be talking about this week is the week 5 assignments. And of course you have some readings you need to do. One of them is regarding Elton Mayo's work. Remember, he was the primary researcher associated with the Hawthorne experiments, and also there's an article on the contributions of Mary Parker Follett, who was again one of the few female contributors early in the days of management research and writing. So she's an important figure to identify with also. And then we have a third article, 3 Levels of Organizational Challenge and Change, and the idea here is kind of leading us up to the fact that different situations require different types of leadership, what we have come to call the contingency theory. Okay, and that's the primary reading, the assigned reading, and of course you'll be using additional readings as you start to prepare your discussion and your paper. Speaking of the discussion, this one is related to the environment that leaders must take into account. And again, this deals specifically with contingency, the idea that different environments require different sorts of actions on the part of the leaders, and what the barriers are that would be expected. So there would be 1,000 different ways you could write about this, but I want you to kind of focus on the environment, meaning human behavior and organizational culture, because that's what the readings focus on. So rather than talk about global competition or political upheavals or things like that, consider the environment to just simply mean the way people behave, and especially the way they behave within an organizational setting. And we're going to be looking at the barriers within that particular environment, meaning what sort of things make employees do bad things, or make employees refuse to change to do things the way that are necessary. So in this case, barriers are going to refer to elements of human behavior and organizational culture that make it difficult for leaders and managers to accomplish what they want to. Wally is one of my favorite characters in Dilbert, and Wally says that the experts say lazy employees are the best because the lazy employees know how to find shortcuts. And the boss says, so I assume you found a lot of shortcuts then. Wally says, me? Oh, no, I'm not lazy, I'm useless. The boss says, well, why did you bring this up then? And Wally says, well, why wouldn't I? I'm not lazy. So you're also supposed to use an example from your workplace or your previous experience. And what I would like you to do is to describe the specific actions that the leader took when faced with these type of barriers, whether it be lack of motivation, whether it be incompetence, whether it be resistance to change, whatever you have identified as a barrier. How did this leader, or how did you, decide to deal with it? What specific actions did you take? So that's it for the discussion. And the paper for this week deals with a couple of managerial and leadership concepts that have become quite kind of popular both in the academic press as well as the popular press. One is the Blake Mouton's managerial grid, and the other is the Hersey and Blanchard's situational leadership style. There's a lot written on these. You should have no trouble finding mountains of information about them. They're both usually presented in forms of a graph or a chart. The Blake Mouton's grid is a commonly used two-dimensional grid where we have axis for results, concern for results, and the vertical axis, the concern for people. Then we divide our grid up into 4 sections based on low, high, and then in each one of those quadrants we have a particular label that is associated with the type of management that would occur in that sort of environment. Now, it's easy to find out how it works, but you're going to have to do a little more than simply describe the grid for me. You can put a picture of the grid in your paper, that's fine, and I can look at it. So describing the diagram really isn't telling me very much. And the same thing with the Hersey-Blanchard situational leadership framework. It's a little more complicated. There's a little bit more going on in terms of the diagram. However, simply telling me, well, it's divided into 2 sections, and 2 sections vertically and 4 sections horizontally, and it's got a ribbon running through it with the different types of leadership and as they relate to followership readiness. It's sort of like, well, I know I can look at the diagram. What you have to do is kind of explain in more detail. So what does it mean? Why would we possibly use that? So you should read articles about both of these frameworks. And I refer to them as frameworks as opposed to theories because they've really been evolved into almost a consulting tool for companies trying to develop leadership or evaluate leadership capabilities. Many times they'll bring in and use one of these frameworks. I'd like you to provide some background. Where do these frameworks come from? What research were they based on? Are they accepted as being valid or not? How do they differ from the theories that came before them? They were both developed in relatively the same time period, so what were they based upon? What are the frameworks showing? How do they work? Compare and contrast them. Are they similar in certain ways? Are they different in certain ways? To help explain them, comparing and contrasting the two is useful. And finally, these days, and here we are in the 2010s to 15s, what's the general consensus? Are people still referring to this as valid, important research, or are these kind of passé and nobody talks about those anymore? We've got a newer and better flavor. So I'd like to kind of get a feeling for what the research is currently saying about these two frameworks. You'll find a lot about them, but we should find out, well, what does the academic world think about them now? So the keys to success for week number 5. Pay attention to the assigned articles. Make sure you're keeping notes on those because you will find uses for them in both the discussion posting and as well as the paper that you're going to be writing. Look ahead. Week 6 does not have a paper, but week 7 does have a paper, and it will be a similar style paper to this week's paper. We'll just be looking at different authors, but we'll be kind of laying it out the same way, looking for comparisons, trying to describe what their research was based upon and how they're viewed today. All these authors are considered to be mainstream in the field of motivation and leadership, and it's important to know their names and kind of know what their contributions were. So again, as you're thinking about this week's paper and how you're going to organize it, you're probably going to be doing it in a similar fashion in week number 7. Start your preparations early. As I said in the video on scholarly writing part 2, you can't just sit down at 10:30 on Sunday night and write a 7 to 10 page paper. You might be able to write words, but you're not writing a scholarly paper that shows that you've done the research and demonstrates that you can prove your points and make your argument. And like I said, is the comparison to a lawyer that you're actually going to win your case. You won't. You won't have done the preparation. So when I provide you with feedback on your papers and tell you, yes, you're doing a good job on this, your introduction looks good, your preparation, your research looks good, well, keep that up. You've got to do that. When I point out areas that it seems like you were rather weak, you didn't really support your arguments, you didn't really conclude anything, you didn't kind of analyze things to a certain extent and end up with any particular conclusions that were uniquely yours, that's an area to work on. So I expect improvements. I've given you, I think, enough guidance to make improvements. And so if you have any questions, you know how to get in touch with me. So until next week, goodbye and good luck.